Hey everyone, just to let you know that this is the third part of a 3-part supercut of all the devlogs for A Farmer's Life, the farming simulator game inspired by Stardew Valley that I've been making in Scratch for the past 2 years. The first part covered everything to the first official release of the game, the second everything in the Animals update and the Fisherman update, and both will be linked in the description down below and in the iCard if you haven't seen them. Today we'll be covering episodes 29 through 48, which covers the individuality update and the culinary update, bringing us to where the project is today. Enjoy! I updated the art for the small rocks, updating the base rock art and creating 2 more random varieties for them to create more visual interest, especially where there are a lot of rocks grouped together. I had to go through any mechanics relating to the rocks and make sure that it still worked for the new varieties, like breaking rocks and displaying the health bar. And finally, I made it so that the farm is 12 tiles wide instead of 10. Someone requested this because they wanted to be able to place things in neat rows of 10, and as 2 of the tiles are taken up by fences, it needed to be 12 wide, not 10. I then did all the artwork for the new crops, of which there are 9: bell peppers, courgette, lettuce, aubergine, Brussels sprouts, onions, garlic, turnips, and watermelon. And for each of these I needed to make 3 sprites, 2 growth stages and a harvest stage. I wanted to add these because with all the new additions into the game, I was worried that the farming part of this farming game was becoming a tad bit overlooked. The trickiest thing with this was making them all look different, because a lot of plants look really similar until the veggie part of it grows in, but really as long as they look kinda different, I think they had enough visual interest, and I referenced a lot of different diagrams of growth stages and the like to try and make them at least somewhat recognizable. And then I had to add the new costumes to the overlay sprite and add the hitboxes to the collision sprite before touching up the art for the cauliflowers and the pumpkins, because I just really didn't like how they looked. They were a bit blocky, a holdover from the old art style I suppose, so I brought those up to snuff. Then I made the inventory icons for all the necessary new items, so all of the crops as well as seeds for any that aren't root vegetables, which act as their own seeds. For the seeds, I found it quite challenging in some cases to make the incredibly tiny versions of the crop to go onto the packet, but I think I got something decent enough for each, and then I just had to match each of these icons in a slightly larger version for the actual crop. There were a few things that I had to do to get these into the game. I had to make labels for each new item, add them to the item index, get them displaying in the correct inventory tabs, and to make it so that seeds can actually be planted. The new crops will take way longer to grow than the old ones, and I also increased the growth times for the old ones very slightly because I found when playtesting that the speed at which the crops grew made the whole situation feel a bit busy and overwhelming. Next, I worked on the UI for the upgrade in the lab that will unlock all of these new crops. I needed to make an icon for the page with a ticked out version for once it's unlocked, as well as an upgrade description and a mouse over title. I added it to the item index and set its base cost and got it to display on the lab page, which required me to make a new page because there were just too many icons on the farm page once this one was added. Then I added the new items to the shop, which was a bit fiddly because with so many unlockable items I needed to make it so that the game could calculate how many pages the buy and sell tabs needed based on what upgrades had been unlocked. I also had to add all of the new crops into the logbook, which involved creating a blacked out version of each crop and adding them to the logbook page, as well as ensuring that they are factored in when awarding the harvest every crop achievement. And the final thing that I did this week was to add in the goods related to these new crops, so that's pickles for all of the veg, as well as jam and a drink for the watermelon. I created the art for all of these and the UI for the crafting page. I made it so that the icons display into the workspaces and black out if you don't have enough of the ingredients. I also needed art for the item label UI. I made it so that these items can actually be crafted. I also needed to add these items to the logbook, and I had it so that the goods are factored into the collect every goods achievement. I'll be improving the mining in the game because it's something that I felt was lacking in my playtests. I wanted to add crystals. I started by creating art for the crystals as they'll appear in the quarry, as well as icons for them in the inventory. I repurposed these for the pickup icons and the lab upgrade that will cause the crystals to spawn. I also needed a ticked out version of the icon for this. Then I made some UI elements like the titles for the new items and the upgrade, as well as the UI for the upgrade in the lab, which included 2 different descriptions depending on whether you're unlocking the crystals in the first place or increasing their spawn chance, which will happen under the same unlock. I added the new upgrade to the mining page of the lab and got everything displaying correctly before getting the upgrade to actually spawn the crystals and making it so that the crystals can actually be mined, dropping the appropriate item when that happens. But I also wanted to make the mining itself more fun because I always found it to be a bit of a chore, so I thought, what makes anything more entertaining? And the answer, explosions. So I decided to add in bombs, starting with the art for 3 different bomb tools, which I got to display when the player's at the quarry, before making the art and and UI for buying the bomb at the blacksmith, so icons and titles. I also wanted to be able to sell the new crystal items at the blacksmiths, so I created shop icons for these as well, before making it so that you can actually buy the bombs in the blacksmiths, which took a bit of figuring out because they aren't considered items in the same way that the ore or crystals are, so I had to factor each one in individually. But once you can buy the bombs, I needed to make it so that they can be placed by the player and actually blow up the surrounding tiles. The weak bomb damages the tiles directly above, below and either side of the central tile. The standard damages the surrounding 8 tiles and the strong damages the surrounding 20. I had to create a custom block that handles damaging and, if appropriate, destroying the surrounding entities. This had to factor in a lot of different things, one of which was, for example, the large rocks, which had to damage the entire rock regardless of which of the tiles fell within range. Next, I wanted a shadow image of the bomb to appear where the player would place it when the bomb is selected and the player mouses over the empty tile. So I needed to create art for each of the bombs as they would exist in the world. So there's a small one with a copper band, a medium with an iron band, and a large with a gold band. And I added the code to get these to appear with a ghost effect of 50 to make it clear that it's a shadow of what will be placed, unlike the rocks and things which exist physically within the space and are therefore completely opaque. And finally, I made it so that there's UI to display how many of the selected bomb you have left. I'll be adding in character customization into the game. I started by recoloring the player to be in different shades of red. This will allow me to change the color and brightness effects of the sprite to give the player basically any skin color and make it so that the skin color can be changed in game. I also altered the way that the player is animated slightly to reduce the number of costumes that I need, which, considering that this sprite is going to have a lot of costumes, was pretty vital. Then I split the player sprite in two, one for the upper and one for the lower body. Next, I made the art for the overalls, which will still be the default outfit for the player, and I got those to render over the player's body. Then I added in the player's eyes in any frames that they'd be visible, and the eyes are something else that the player will be able to recolor to their preference. And then I moved on to the first of many hairstyles, which is a basic short hair. I also experimented with adding eyebrows, but given the small amount of pixels I had to work with, they looked really weird, so I axed that. And then I did the art for the shoes. Something that I really wanted to improve on in this animation upgrade is the animation for when tools are used. Before, all tools used the exact same animation regardless of what type and level of tool was used, but I really wanted to have a visual difference for each, so I drew each tool being used in each direction and then went through and copied, then recolored each of the tools for the 4 level varieties. Next, I wanted to make it so that if you're in the quarry and have the bomb selected, you'll hold it over your head, which is a key reason that I wanted the body and leg sprites to be split in two. I redrew the body sprites to have the arms raised and got this to display when the player is holding a bomb. I had to draw the torso for the overalls in the same position and also had to draw the bombs and get those rendering above the player's head. And then it was the art for the different cosmetic variations, starting with another longer hairstyle option as well as glasses. These will be considered an extra cosmetic option, as will things like facial hair, and the player will only be able to have one of these selected at any given time. So they could have glasses or they could have a beard, but not both. I got these to render before moving on to the aforementioned beard. I then moved on to the UI for the character customization menu with labels for the different aspects of the player that you can modify, and I then needed to make some UI to display which hairstyle or extra is selected, and for this I needed to create a list of all the character info that the UI can get the appropriate information from to display. For the other customizable elements, namely the colors and brightnesses of each of the elements, we needed sliders. So I made the UI for this, which was made of 2 different sprites, a bar and a handle, and got one of these to display for each element, with the handle position correctly reflecting the default value of each element. I made it so that these sliders can slide with a nice little mouse over effect for the handle. I made it so that the sliders modify the appropriate value in the character list, and I made it so that you can see your avatar on screen as you edit it, so you know what your end result will look like. I also made a play button for once you're satisfied with your design, and I got that displaying correctly and functioning appropriately. And then I had to go through and make sure that the players in-game reflect all the players' customization options correctly, so pulling costumes and brightnesses and colors from the list every time the player is rendered, and only displaying hair and extras if and when necessary. From here, I just need to add in a few more hair and extras options. For the hair, I did an option to give the character bunches. I also recolored the glasses accessory to turn them into sunglasses. And next I added in a new crop, cotton. I drew the 3 growth stages for the crop itself, making sure to keep the look distinct from any of the other crops, and I incorporated it into the sorting order and collision systems. I also created 3 new items: cotton seeds, raw cotton, which is what the cotton plant will produce, and refined cotton, which will craft from the raw cotton. I needed to create labels for each of these, and I added a new tab to the inventory page for items related to clothing. Next, I created a new workspace, the spinning wheel. This is where you'll craft any textile related products. I started with the art for the workspace as it will appear on your farm, complete with a spinning animation for when it's working, crafting, and then made the label and UI for it as it will appear in the hardware store. I made it so that the workspace appears in the inventory and so that you can place and open the workspace. I then made any necessary UI for the crafting page for the refined cotton and set it up so that you can actually set the product to craft. I also want to add wool as a crafting material, and for that we need sheep. I added another upgrade level to the barn and also made the button that will allow you to buy sheep, and I made it so that there's an extra page in the barn for these sheep to appear on. I then did the art for the sheep themselves, starting with the baby lamb and then moving on to the adult varieties. Unlike the other animals, I had to make two versions of the adult animal to show the sheep before and after being sheared. I then got the sprites to switch to these costumes as appropriate. I added art for 3 new animal products, starting with leather, which I'll be giving cows the chance to drop, and then moving on to raw wool, which is a recolor of raw cotton, and use the same sprite for the icon to shear the sheep, and finally mutton, which is the meat product that the sheep will drop. I also created labels for the lamb, the sheep, and all 3 of these items, and got the items to show in the inventory. Next, I had to make it so that you can sell these new animal products in the barn shop, which required me to put the items on grey backgrounds and set the prices for each item. I also made a new tool that you can purchase in the barn shop, much like the milk bucket or cleaver, and that is shears to collect the wool. I implemented the ability to shear the sheep when shears are selected, provided that the sheep have wool to collect, and I made some new upgrades for the lab. 3 bags full causes sheep to produce more wool, grow up causes animals to become adults quicker, and each of these needed an icon with a ticked out version to show that they're complete, a label and a description. I made it so that these upgrades unlock when the barn is at an appropriate level and implemented the functionality behind these upgrades. And then I realized I needed one more upgrade, well-eye leather, that allows cows to sometimes drop leather when killed. Once that was done, I made art for some new items, starting with refined wool, which we'll make from raw wool, and then moved on to dyes, which we'll make from crystals. I also created a material, denim, which we'll make from refined cotton. These needed to be added to the item index, and I made a name label for each of these new items. Before adding them into the spinning wheels crafting page, I made the art for a host of different outfits that you'll be able to craft with the new fabric materials. I tried to think of a variety of different basic looks that the player might want to equip on their character, painfully aware that with each new look I was giving myself a lot of extra work to do, also aware that it would be so worth it to give the player the chance to make their character look like they want to. I added these items to the item index, created the name labels for each one, and made the UI to display what ingredients you need to craft them. I added them to the spinning wheel and added in all the code that I needed to make it so that you can actually craft them. And then I made the art for the first clothing item, the t-shirt. Before doing any more of the art for the clothing, I wanted to make the page where you can actually equip them so I could start testing the drawing system for the clothes. This page needed tabs for the 4 different types of equipable clothing, as well as the dye slots for the hat, shirt and trousers. I also added a back button that will take you back to the farm. I made it so that the tab icon is replaced with the appropriate item if something is already equipped in that slot. Then I got all the equipable options to display with arrows to scroll through these if there are enough of the different options for that to be necessary. Then I got the shirt that I made to render, setting its color effect based on the equipped dye or lack thereof if the case may be. I first set up all of this for the character render in the wardrobe page before extrapolating this out into a custom block and replacing any instance of the shirt being rendered to use this code. And from there I had everything in place to go on a bit of an artwork marathon, making all of the different costumes that I needed for each type of clothing, trying to make each one different and unique enough to tell them apart, with cotton clothes being lighter and more saturated than the wool clothing, and giving wool clothing some lighter detailing around the collars and cuffs to make them a bit more visually interesting. I went through and made all of the art for the different trousers and skirts, and then made the code that draws the trousers onto the player, with the colour being set based on whether the item's dyeable, and if so, what dye is equipped if any. I also made it that if a dress is selected in the shirt slot, the trousers are replaced with a skirt, and again I made it so that this was all in a custom block to easily set this throughout my code. For the shoes, I didn't do any separate art for the different types of boots, I just had the shoe assets be recolored to match them. I then made the art for the bobble hat using the same wool colour that I used for the jumper and cardigan, and partially because I just felt like I was on a roll, and partially because I felt that it was weird and incomplete to only have one type of craftable hat, I came up with 3 more. A straw hat, which will be made from wheat, a bucket hat, which will be made from iron, and a crown, which will be made from gold and red crystals. Next, I made the custom block to handle drawing both the hat and, if no hat is equipped, the player's hair. Finally, I went through the process of making the 3 new hats into craftable items. I added a farmhouse to the world map, which required me to make the icon for it and a label for when it's moused over. I had to create a basic interior wall and floor, as well as a few items of furniture, and I got those rendering with the player able to walk around the space. I also made it so that you can leave the house through an opening in the bottom of the room, which will take you back to the map, and open the wardrobe page by clicking on the wardrobe furniture item. The main purpose of this building is for it to be a place that the player can customize quite deeply. Decorating has never been something that I've spent much time on in games like Stardew Valley, but I know that some people spend hours on and stuff like that, which is why it is such a big part of games like Stardew or like Animal Crossing, say, and it gives something for players to invest their hard-earned coins into. I wanted to add different coloured wallpapers, but I only did the art for the red and could change the colour effect of this to get the different colours to display. And then I did some more walls, starting with a galaxy patterned wallpaper. While the repeating pattern will be pretty obvious, I did want to make sure that there wasn't at least an ugly seam between the tiles, so I had to be really careful to keep a smooth transition. I also did a cobbled brick pattern, and for any type of brick or stonework, varying the colours of the different stones a little makes a world of difference to how good the tiles will look. I also did an underwater wallpaper with a light to dark blue gradient and some fish, as well as a rose patterned wallpaper. And then I quickly threw together a few different flooring styles, 2 different colours of tile, a cobbled paving stone, and carpets. I created inventory icons for each of the walls, including every colour of wallpaper, and I had to repeat this process for all the different floors. And I also had to make labels for each of these wall and floor options. I'll be adding in 2 new locations and 2 new NPCs to go along with them. I started by creating the map icons for said locations, the clothes store and the furniture store, and I got them to display once you've got them built. Speaking of which, I had to make all the UI for the build menu for each of these buildings and got all of that to display, which meant making it so you can scroll through more pages with everything switching to the correct costumes. But now onto my favourite part of making this game, creating new NPCs. The first one is Sasha, and she runs the furniture store. She's an immigrant for whatever version of India exists in this world, so I gave her a traditional outfit and general look. I also took this into consideration for the background with decorations that reflect her culture and heritage. And it was much the same process for the other NPC, Sasha's older brother Santi. I wanted these two to look similar enough that they could believably be siblings, and I got both of these guys to display when you're on the right tab. Then I made the quotes for each character. Sasha's tended to relate to themes around home and homesickness to play into the fact that she sells things to decorate the player's house, as well as her character's story. And Santi's may seem random at first, but they're actually all Shakespeare quotes relating to fashion, to tie together his running the clothes store and his being a thespian. And I got these to display on the correct tabs, and then I made small versions of both of these guys for the start screen, and I combined both of them into one start screen character, because I kind of want players to think of these two as a matching set, although they'll each have their own unique stories. I got these to display on the start screen to animate correctly and to react when clicked. I also added them to the project thumbnail. You'll be able to sell any of the craftable clothing items, so I needed to add these to the clothes store sprite, and yes, I started off by doing them in the wrong colour. I fixed that pretty quickly. I also had to calculate a fair cost for each item, given the cost of each of the ingredients used to craft them, plus a little bit extra. And I also want you to be able to buy some more specific clothing items, so I created the art for their icons. There's a set of rain gear, a suit and top hat, men's and women's kimonos, military gears, and a poncho sombrero combo. I then had to add each of these items to the clothes store sprite and recolor them to match the rest of the UI, and I had to set a price for each item and copy the code in to allow you to sell them. I also had to add these items to the wardrobe so you can equip them once you've bought them. Then I made all of the art for the clothes as they'll be rendered onto the player, which was a long repetitive process as I needed to create a costume for every position that the player can be in, but it's definitely worth it to give the player these customization options. And finally, I made the music for the clothes store page. Because the shopkeeper Santi is an actor, I decided to play around with orchestral instruments such as violins, grand pianos, tubas, and the like to create something with a theatrical feel. And I had to add the 4 existing furniture items that I have in the farmhouse to the inventory. There's the basic wardrobe, bed, table, and chair. Each of these needed an icon and a name label. I added these 4 items to the item index and I gave them their places in the inventory. This required me to make a new inventory tab to accommodate them, the furniture tab, which required its own icon based on a table and a name label in the big title font. I then copied these items' icons as well as icons for all the walls and floors into a new sprite. I recolored these into the reds of the furniture store UI, and for all the walls and floors I duplicated their recolored icons and added the green unlock tick mark that I've used in the lab and barn for other single purchase items. I also needed to make 3 title costumes for the different types of items, walls, floors and furniture. I then got that UI to display on the furniture store page. Next I focused on getting the correct item icons to appear on the correct tabs, as well as delete any of these items when you switch tabs. I also needed a way of logging what floors and walls were unlocked or otherwise, which required me to add in a couple new lists to contain that information. This allowed me to make sure that the costumes for these switched to their ticked out versions where appropriate. And then I sorted out the mouse over effects for each of the items. Then I made it so that you can purchase any of these items and walls and floors. Started with the furniture because I knew that it was just a drag and drop copy paste job for one of the many other shops that I've already made, and I also added in the code to unlock the walls and floors, which wasn't too tough. It just had to change a value in the appropriate lists and adjust your money accordingly. And finally I put together the shop soundtrack. I wanted this to have an Indian feel to it to mirror the shopkeeper Sasha's yearning to go back to her home country. I'll be adding the ability to decorate the farmhouse with all of the walls, floors and furnishings that I've added so far this update. I started by making some new icons. These included a move tool, a store tool, a rotate tool, and a clothes hanger that will allow you to open the wardrobe, as well as a decorate icon. I initially made it so that only the decorate icon shows when you enter the farmhouse, and I started to give the button some functionality, like making it so that the clothing icon opens the wardrobe instead of it opening as soon as you click on the wardrobe furniture item. I made it so that you could store the items. The biggest consideration here was that some of the furniture takes up multiple spaces, like the bed or the table, and I had to make sure that the storing of items covers any tiles that these objects take up. Next, I had to make it so that you can move objects. I had to create a list to contain information such as whether you're actively trying to move an object or if it's just selected, with the tools that are displayed changing based on whether or not this is true, and what tiles are affected based on the size and direction of the furniture item and what type of furniture item it is. I made it so that objects highlight if selected and ghost out if you're trying to move them. I also added a ghosted out overlay of where the item will be placed based on your mouse position, and I made it so that you can rotate any object except the square table that doesn't have rotation. I then had to sort out placing the objects. I then made the decorate tab where you can select the wall or floor that you want for your house and furniture items that you want to place. I recolored the furniture store's tab buttons for this page and made it so that you can switch between the tabs by clicking on them. I got the correct items to render on the page, with the brightness determined by whether you have the item and in the case of the walls and floors if it's selected, as well as the usual mouse over highlight. I added a back button to take you back to the farmhouse if you're done with the decoration. For the walls and floors, I needed it to say locked if you're yet to purchase the item, click to select if you bought it but not equipped it, and selected if the wall or floor is currently equipped in your house. The last two required me to make new UI labels to display, and I could then sort out actually clicking the items, making it so that you can set the walls and floors. I then added in a gramophone furniture item, and I also made the icon for it in the inventory and the furniture store. I also needed a name label, and I added it to the item index. I got it displaying in the inventory, furniture store, and farmhouse decorate menu. I also needed to add this new object to the sprites that determine the sorting order layers and the collision system. I then wanted to make this item functional, so I made a button for the toolbar with a musical note. This will allow you to select which track you want to play in areas such as the farm, farmhouse, and bulletin board. I needed to make a button for every possible track, as well as arrows to scroll through the options, and I got these to display with options such as the barn track only becoming available if you've built the relevant building, and I gave the buttons functionality with the arrows allowing you to scroll up and down the list if there are enough options for this to be needed. I made it so that the song buttons actually change the song that's being played in the background. I did also add in a few non-functional furniture items as well, to give the player a few more decoration options. There's a leather chair and sofa, a bedside table, and a rainbow of differently coloured potted plants. Each of these needed art for how they'd appear in the farmhouse, with art for each rotation for everything except the plants, which can't be rotated. These needed inventory icons and name labels and had to be worked into the layering and collision systems. I then added each to the furniture store, inventory, and decoration pages, and then worked them all into the furniture placement, rotation, and storing systems. I had to update the request board to feature our new NPCs. I added new items that I've made so far in this update to the requests, and made it so that Santi prefers items of clothing, and I wasn't really sure what to do with Sasha, so I made her favour the dyes. I get the impression that she'd like bright, pretty colours. And I added the new crops from this update to Bessa's favoured list, and the new animal products to Bridget's. I'll be adding in bees. I started by making the art for a beehive workspace, and unlike the other workspaces, instead of crafting items at it, you just place it on your farm where it will automatically create honey and speed up the growth time of any crop in an adjacent tile. And I had to add it to the overlay and collision system so that it can correctly appear on the farm. And I made the icon for it as it will appear in the inventory and hardware store pages. I needed to create a name label before I could get it displaying in said pages, and I needed to create a description for the hardware store that will describe the aforementioned purpose of the beehive workspace. I made it so that you can place the beehive on your farm, and in order to get it to generate honey, I needed to, add honey. I made it so that the beehive regularly produces this new item in much the same way as any workspace crafts an object, but without the player needing to trigger it beforehand, and added in the functionality behind the neighbouring crops growing faster. I also added in 3 new bee-related lab upgrades: more honey, which increases how much honey is generated per cycle; busier bees, which decreases how long each cycle takes; and powerful pollination, which increases how much the growth times of neighbouring crops are decreased by the hive. From there, it's just a lot of wrapping up the stray ends of the update. I started off by making all of the how to play tutorial pages for all of the new features, such as how the beehive works, as well as how to decorate the farmhouse. Then there's just all of the usual polish stuff, like like sorting out the save load features, which is always a right pain, and then just playtesting until I find some bug or another, some sound effect that I forgot, or anything that disrupts the flow of gameplay or what have you, and then fixing it. I realized that I hadn't added a lot of new items to the completion log, so I created the blacked out icon for cotton and the new animal products and got these to appear as appropriate, and then I went through and made sure that it checked for these when unlocking the crops and animal product achievements whenever these achievements are checked for. There were a few bugs with the big rocks from when I changed the farm size, like issues with health bars and quarry regen, so I fixed those, and I added the new crops to the barn refill page, which is something I'd completely forgotten to do until now, creating the correctly coloured icons and making them appear if tier 2 crops have been researched. Next was what I'm thinking might be a bit of a controversial change. I basically slowed everything down a smidge. Trees and crops take longer to grow, fruit trees take longer to produce, and just to balance things out a little, tiles stay watered a smidge longer. I did this for two reasons. First off, with everything working as fast as it did, there wasn't much incentive to use the research lab to speed things up, like it didn't feel rewarding enough. And second, with the amount of features that this game has now, the start of the game felt a bit frantic, like there wasn't enough time to do the other things before having to rush back to the crops you literally just planted. I'll be kicking off the new build of the game with a new location, the shipping depot. This is where you'll be able to trade large quantities of crops, animal products, fish, etc. for exotic seeds and produce that you can't otherwise obtain from local shops. I started by making the icon for the shipping depot on the map. I wanted it to look quite industrial, with a warehouse and a crane surrounded by what are supposed to be shipping containers, although at such a tiny scale I'm not sure how obvious it is that that's what the colourful rectangles are meant to be. And I made a name label for when this is moused over before coding it so that the icon appears on the map if the shipping depot is built. Speaking of which, let's make it so you can build the darn thing, shall we? I went over to the hardware store sprite and added a new page to the build menu. And with all that sorted, I spent some time drawing the background for the shipping depot. I designed this to look like a computer, as though you're receiving this trade offer over the web, and behind it I added some general desk clutter like a plant pot and some stationery. I also coloured the back wall to look like it's made of wooden paneling. I also had to make some UI for the page. I created name titles and logos for a few different companies that can request trades from you. They're named pretty generically, with a couple being suggestions from my Discord, and I only added 5 for now. It won't make any difference to gameplay, it's just a bit of world building. I also had to recolour any items that can be requested in a trade to fit on this page, and I created a separate sprite for each that indicates if the sprite is moused over with a box around it, as the usual highlight method that I had been using to indicate a mouse over looks out of place in this case. I also created buttons to submit a trade if you have the items, as well as one to discard the current trade, and I needed to draw in a sprite for each number in the style of the page so I can use this to display how many of each item is being requested. Then I went through and coded in the bulk of the page's functionality. I set it up so that all of the right clones appear in the right places, and once I had the shell of the page looking good, I added the code to generate all the information that a trade request would need to a list. This included which company the request comes from and what 3 items are being requested in what quantity. Given this information, I could get the clones for the produce to switch to the correct items and could code it in so that the numbers displayed with the requested value. I made it so that the discard button generates a new order and that the send button only does so if you have any items, removing said items from the inventory. One thing I didn't do was to give the player any reward for the trade just now, because this will require me adding in quite a lot of new items, and I'm going to sort out all of that in the next devlog. But otherwise, I also got the UI to display how many of a requested item you currently possess when you mouse over them, and I also decided to make it so that the same type of item could not be requested twice in a single order. I also added in 5 new trade related upgrades. The first upgrade, bulk buying, creates a chance for trade requests to be bigger, while the other 4 unlock new categories of trade, so to speak. So the first, Apple Pay, unlocks trade requests for fruit, Big Farmer unlocks requests for tier 2 crops, Chicken Trade for animal products, and We Buy Any Carp for fish. I got the trade upgrade tab to generate in as appropriate with all of the correct icons on the page, and I added the new upgrades to the upgrade index list. I sorted out making it so that these upgrades become available if the shipping depot is built, and for every upgrade except bulk buying, if whatever the unlock request is for is also unlocked. Presumably they will be. The cost of the shipping depot is so high that the odds of you building it before the barns say are slim, but if something's possible in a game, someone's gonna do it. And I went through and actually implemented the functionality behind each upgrade. I set it up so that all the items in a trade are in the same category, so that if the first item request is, for example, a fish, then the others will also be a fish. If it's a tier 2 crop, so will therefore the others be. It makes the orders feel less completely random. And I also made it so that based on the rarity of the item type requested, the less of them are asked for. I created a backing track for the shipping depot in soundtrack. Because of the digital computer-based nature of the page, I wanted it to sound 8-bit and video gamey, so I used that style of synth for the main line of the song, and under that I added a rhythmic clickety-clack sound to try and invoke the sound of like a conveyor belt that you might find in a warehouse. When I was satisfied, I added it into the music manager so that it can play when the shipping depot page is open, and I also had to add it to the gramophone. I'll be adding in a whole host of new items. These fall into 2 camps. Most of them are possible rewards that you get for completing the trades in the shipping depot. The rest are 5 types of berry bush and their related produce and goods. First came creating an icon for each possible new item. Other than the berries that I just covered, there are 2 new trees, cacao and coffea, which produce cacao pods and coffee beans, which can be further refined into cocoa powder and coffee respectively. There are 3 new standard crops, chili peppers, pineapple and soybeans. The chili can be turned into chili powder, the pineapple into jam and wine, and the soybeans into tofu or soy sauce. And then there are sugarcane and rice, which will act similarly to regular crops but will be needed to be planted in the river at the bottom of the farm. I added the new items to the inventory, and there are now so many goods that I needed to split these into 2 pages that could be scrolled through. I had to add these items to the completion log, creating blacked out silhouettes of all the new items, or at least the ones with unique silhouettes. For the jams and the wine, I could reuse some of the existing ones, and getting them all laid out nice and neatly onto their pages. And then I went through and made sure that anywhere that checks for the grow all the crops achievement or the make all the goods achievement, and ensured that the new items are all factored into the equations. Next, I made it so that the shipping depot gives you a fair amount of these rewards, and to get all of this working, I had to add the new items to the shipping depot UI with the blacked out backgrounds and the mouse over crosshair, and to create UI to indicate that these are the rewards. I also created a button to allow you to claim these rewards and to generate a new trade. I also made it so that if you discard an order, there's a little cooldown before the next one spawns in to stop the player from just spamming the discard button until they find a trade that suits them. And finally, I added in 3 new lab upgrades: fair trade agreement, which increases the factor by which the trade reward value is multiplied; advertising campaign, which decreases the cooldown when you discard a trade before the next one spawns in; and berry bushes, which will allow you to buy berry bushes in the shop. I had to go through and make sure they were unlocked at the right times. After the fruit trees upgrade is unlocked for the berry bushes, and for the other 2 when the shipping depot is built. Implementing the trade related upgrades is all smooth sailing. I just had to sub these in for values that I already had in place as static numbers. And for the berry bushes upgrade, I made it so that the berry related items appear on the correct tabs in the shop if the upgrade has been researched, as well as some of the possible trade rewards if the shipping depot is built. You can sell the direct produce from the crops but not seeds or anything refined from the crops, with the exception of pineapple, jam and wine. So I had to make costumes for each growth stage for every crop, tree and bush that I added last time. I began with the berry bushes, which needed 3 costumes per: a small growing bush, a big grown bush, and the same grown bush spotted with berries for once it's ready to harvest. I then made the 3 costumes for each of the 3 conventional crops, the pineapple, soybean and chili pepper plants. These were a bit more specific and detailed than the bushes were, with a focus on A, reflecting the real life appearance of the crops, and B, just trying to make them look different enough to the other crops in the game. The 2 tree types, coffea and cacao, both required 4 costumes apiece: a small sapling, a mid-stage sapling, a grown tree, and a grown tree with their produce ready for picking. And then there are the rice and sugarcane crops, which are planted in the river at the base of the farm. These also both have 3 growth stages, but because they are in the water, each stage required 3 costumes to animate the water rising and falling as it ripples along. Then I began to code it so that you can actually place these things, adding in all of the new seeds, bushes, saplings and starters to the placeable items list, and making sure that the correct UI displayed for each to show where they can be placed, which required me to make a new water's edge tile icon for the rice and sugarcane crops. And then I coded it so that you can plant each of these. I needed to ensure that the crops planted in the river animate correctly at the same speed that the water tiles themselves animate, to look like the water's moving as one, before going through and making it so that plants could all grow from one stage to the next until they're fully grown. And then I made it so that you can harvest the crops once they're fully grown. For the trees and standard crops, this was super straightforward. There were just enough differences for the water-based crops to justify rewriting the code for the sake of these, copying the regular harvest script and removing what was unnecessary, changing a few values here and there. And I had to do a fair bit of code for the berries because I needed to accommodate their main identifying mechanic that they can be harvested 3 times before the bush itself is destroyed. For these, I had to add all the craftable items to the workspaces, and then I added 4 new berry related research upgrades to the lab. The 4 upgrades I added today were bountiful berries, which allows you to get more berries per harvest; berry efficient, which causes berries to grow back faster; hardy hedges, which causes bushes to survive an extra harvest; and buying berries, which allows companies to request trades for berries at the shipping depot. I made all of the UI, added them to the lab pages, set the prices, and implemented the mechanics behind each of these upgrades. And the final thing I did was to add the new items to the request board, with berries and their jams becoming available to request once researched, and the rest of the items joining the ranks once you've built the trading depot. It made sense for Becca to prefer berries and their jams, as well as the pineapple and its crafting derivatives, as the older fruit items and their craftables were already on her list, so I modified the code to allow for this if these items are available to request. I'll be adding a new building, the restaurant. Here you'll be able to stock the restaurant with large amounts of ingredients to complete recipes, and when you complete a collection of said recipes, you'll get some other benefit in the game. The first stage of creating this was creating a map icon, which I tried to make look like a somewhat fancy Italian restaurant, and then I got the map icon to display once you've built the restaurant and created the name label for when you mouse over this icon. But in order for that to be relevant at all, you actually need to be able to build the restaurant, right? So I got everything behind that set up and working, which involved creating the UI for the build page with a version of the restaurant image and the monetary cost displayed on that, and then I sorted out all of the code behind it. So now let's move on to the NPC Gitano, the head chef and owner of the restaurant. I created the art for him as he'll appear in the restaurant. In terms of physical characteristics, I wanted him to look like he's really seen the world and been through some sort of physical trauma. He's old with wrinkles and silver facial hair, his face is scarred to the point where he's lost the use of one eye, and he's in a wheelchair. For his clothes, he's dressed as a chef, of course, with a lopsided floppy chef's hat and a white button-up chef's coat. And for the background that appears behind Gitano, I wanted this to look like a restaurant kitchen, but in looking up images of restaurant kitchens, they're a bit boring looking really. It's just a lot of grey, and typically there's a focus on function over looking pretty, which makes sense for the real world but isn't great for fun video game artwork. I did find one reference that had wooden countertops instead of metal ones and hanging lights from the ceiling, and I really liked how that looked, so I used it for my base. I added more detail with some saucepans hanging from a black metal rail and a wall mounted knife rack. For the wall I was going to do pale grey tiles, but I realised that they would blend too much with Gitano's white hat, so I went with a warmer creamy colour instead, and I think I prefer the coziness that this adds to the scene anyway. I then had to make all of the quotes that pop up when you're in the restaurant, of which I made 5. These all relate to the emotional, social and cultural importance of food. I made the smaller version of Gitano to appear on the main title screen. I had to animate him idling, aka bobbing up and down like all of the others, and I had to create a reaction animation for when you click him. In this reaction, he looks to the front as though he's looking at you, the player, wheels himself back a bit, looking up slightly, and then resets himself. And I copied the art for him onto the thumbnail page as well, making sure to match his position in this image to his position on the title screen. The next thing I did was to add Gitano to the request board. I used the version of him from the title screen to create his request icon and altered the UI to display the correct name, and I coded it so that he favours items that you receive from the shipping depot. I made background music for the restaurant in Soundtrap, and I wanted this to have a kind of Italian restaurant vibe. I added the track into the game so that it plays in the restaurant, and also added it to the music menu for the gramophone furniture item once the restaurant has been built. I'll be adding in all of the recipes. I began by coming up with a full list of recipes that I want you to be able to make, adding them to a list which will allow me to easily reference them in my code. When it came to deciding what recipes I wanted, there were 2 major considerations. First was that I wanted each NPC to have a set of recipes related to them, and for these I needed the recipes to fit thematically with the culture and or personality of the NPC. And otherwise I just looked through the potential ingredients that I have in the game and thought what recipes could utilise them effectively, and if the recipes didn't fit with any of the NPCs, there are 2 collections that are unaffiliated with any NPC, so I just stuck them in there. And for each and every one of these recipes I had to make an icon for them as they'll appear in the restaurant. As much as possible I tried to make it so as many of the dishes had the same silhouettes, otherwise my focus was on trying to keep the icons distinct enough from each other while looking enough like whatever food they're meant to be and sticking to a consistent colour palette. Then I made versions of the icons for once you've completed them. To do this I duplicated each and every one of the recipe costumes and then took the tick from the completed icons for the lab page, copied it and then pasted it onto each of these duplicated costumes. And then I went through and made all of the mouse over name labels, and this might be a good time to note there were over 80 different recipes, so let's just say that this took a while. With that done, I made versions of the icons for any recipes that are locked. For some recipes you'll have to unlock them through gameplay, and for these I made blacked out icons like the ones in the completion log for when you haven't discovered an item. And this is why I wanted as many of the items as possible to have the same silhouettes. This meant that for the over 80 recipes I only needed 26 blacked out versions to cover all my bases. I made some more UI for the restaurant page, starting with buttons to open each recipe collection, and I made an up and down arrow to allow you to scroll through these, and I got all of this to display. For the NPC collection buttons I made it so that they're only displayed if the NPC has been discovered, and then I went through and made it so that the correct dishes appear on the different collection pages. Each of these had different numbers of dishes of different shapes and sizes, so I had to play around with things to get them all laid out aesthetically, but I did get each one sorted. I then made UI to display the reward for each collection, and this will display when you mouse over the buttons to open the collections. and these rewards are mostly things like doubling the value of certain items, halving the prices in certain shops, or improving things like crafting times or how much ore is dropped by nodes in the quarry. And I coded it so that this UI displays when I want it to. I decided that I wanted each collection page to display the collection's name on the page, so I created the UI for that and coded it so that it displayed correctly. I then made it so that the locked recipes display the blacked out icons. I made it so that if you mouse over a locked recipe, the mouse over label switches to 3 question marks rather than the recipe's name. And finally, there were 4 items that I wanted to add as ingredients for some of the recipes: chocolate, ketchup, mayonnaise, and barbecue sauce. So for each of these, I made the art for their inventory icons and their pickup icons, as well as their mouse over name labels. I added these to the inventory and to the item completion log. I also had to make it so that you can craft these items, which we'll do at the refinery. I'll make it so that you can actually cook all of the recipes. The first thing I did was to make it so that the locked recipes can become unlocked through gameplay. The first way that this occurs is through upgrading the restaurant building, which unlocks the second basic recipe collection. The other type of recipe that can become unlocked are NPC recipes. These require a certain level of friendship with the NPC, which increases whenever you complete a request for said NPC. And I had to code it so that when this friendship level changes, it checks whether or not any of the recipes need to become unlocked based on which NPC you've increased the friendship level with and what value you've increased the friendship level to. With that done, I had to figure out what ingredients I wanted to be used in each and every recipe and to make the UI to display these. Each recipe can have up to 3 ingredients, and when I decided on the quantities, I considered how late in the game you're likely to start getting this item, with early game items requiring quite massive amounts and late game items only requiring small amounts. As I was doing this, there was one more ingredient that I felt like I needed to add, and that was rice noodles for the spring roll and chicken chow mein recipes. I then got the UI to display when you mouse over an unlocked but incomplete recipe, and I made it so that when you complete a recipe, it checks whether you've thereby completed the collection associated with the recipe. Using this info, I coded in all of the recipe collection rewards. I also then made versions of the collection buttons with a tick on them to indicate that the collection is complete. I'll be polishing off everything that I've added so far this update to prepare for the next release of the game, starting with creating a friendship tab for the completion log to record what NPCs you've unlocked and what level of friendship that you've acquired with them. I made an icon of the head of each NPC. For the NPCs that become unlocked when a certain building is built, like Bridget or Felix, I had to make a blacked out version of the icons as well, in the same style as the locked items on the other completion log tabs. There was some other UI that I needed to put together. The first was an icon to click onto the friendship tab, which I designed to look like a little heart. And finally, I made some UI to indicate what level of friendship you're at with each NPC, which is indicated by how many of a set of 5 hearts are lit up. With that done, I jumped over to a system that I haven't updated in a while and added 2 new tasks to the task system. The first of these is wheeling and dealing, which requires you to complete 10 requests at the shipping depot, and the second is Master Chef, which requires you to complete an entire recipe collection in the restaurant. Another system that I haven't updated lately is the achievement system, so I made 2 more achievements related to the new systems that I've added. There's Top Trader, which unlocks when you've completed 1 trade for bronze, 10 for silver, and 100 for gold, and there's Cooking Complete, which unlocks if you've cooked 1, 25, or 75 recipes respectively for bronze, silver, and gold. And I then went through the completion log to make sure that the maximum value on the completion bar is correct to accommodate for all of the new items, achievements, and friendships, and I coded it so that the completion value increases whenever you level up in friendship with an NPC. I also went through and made tutorial pages for the trading and cooking systems for the how-to page. There were also some systems that I felt were missing from the tutorial pages, as they were. This included the request board system, mining, upgrading tools, performing research, or building new buildings. So I went through and made new pages for each of these. Another small thing, I decided I wanted there to be some UI to display what friendship level you need to unlock the locked recipes in the kitchen. For this, I made UI that says you need X hearts with for the values 1 through 5, as these are the 5 possible friendship levels, and it also tells the player that they can check this level in the completion log, as it's not like this is a prominent thing that the player is always able to see, and I don't want them to miss it altogether. Like, what does this mean when they see the recipe unlock prompt? I updated the project's thumbnail so that it gives the correct version and title for the new update, V5, the culinary update, and from there I just had to do a lot of playtesting and bug fixing, starting with the new systems that I've added since the last public build. I also did some longer playtests from the start of the game to find smaller bugs that have until now slipped through the net. This let me sort some issues with pacing and also gave me the chance to test things like the save load functionality. Again, this is something I'll be working on up through to the game's release, squashing bugs as they crop up. And apart from that, that's all I've got to show you this week, so thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe if you did, it lets me know there's something to see more of. Join the Discord, link down below, and I'll see you next week with another video. Bye!